Thank you for joining us here on Icon's Corner of the Sports Gazette. I am Caleb, and I am fascinated today by my guest, Mr. Mihir Bose, a journalist of note, acclaimed journalist of 50 years worth of experience. He's done amazing work with regards to segregation, politics and sport. And I'm fascinated about his thoughts in terms of sport being increasingly involved with politics, but more specifically, you wrote something, sir. Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us. Before I get ahead of myself, you wrote something with relation to the Virat Kohli and Mohammad Shami incident, where Kohli went out and spoke out about the abuse that Shami received for being a Muslim, playing for the Indian cricket team after India had lost to Pakistan. And Kohli then came to England, and they played England. He later spent some time with Moeen Ali, a devout Muslim. What do you think in terms of, do our sports fans have a lot to change in terms of their perceptions and responsibilities they place on sports people in terms of their beliefs?
Well, I mean, if you have noticed, recently there have been some terrible Hindu-Muslim riots in Leicester, triggered by the fact that Pakistan beat India in a T20 match. And I think sport is used, if you like, by people as a symbol. I mean, Norman Tebbit famously said, you know, in order to prove, for an immigrant to prove that they really belong to this country, they have to show their support of the England cricket team. And I must say, I don't support the England cricket team, particularly when they play India, because I grew up with Indian cricket. But that doesn't mean that should England and India have a war, I won't fight for England. Not that they would recruit me, and I wouldn't be very useful, but nevertheless, to confuse sport in that sense with what happens in a political world is wrong. I think where Virat Kohli stood out was India and Pakistan are going through a very explosive time. The changes that are taking place in India, particularly the rise of the Hindu fanatic beliefs and the Hindu fanaticism that is saying is very distressing. And in that background, for Kohli to come out and say what he did showed Kohli's status, showed Kohli's power, showed the new Indian cricketer that has emerged. I mean, this is not the first time that a Muslim cricketer in India has been abused when India play Pakistan and India lose. But this is the first time that an Indian captain and one of India's leading cricketers was willing to speak out on it. And that marked a big moment. And I think sports players from all over should be able to do that. I mean, if you follow what happened with Yorkshire cricket, you know, a lot of cricketers, you know, Joe Root, a very fine cricketer, wonderful cricketer, had to be sort of pushed into saying what he did after Asim Rafiq had spoken, not before. And I think that sense of awareness, I think that awareness is still developing. Sportsmen are quite willing to trade on the fact that they are very big figures, that they have an aura beyond their playing fields, but they're not willing, if you like, to take responsibility for what that means.
You talk about an interesting word there. You talk about willing, and if we put that in relation to Virat Kohli, is it because Kohli is one of those sports people that in the Indian team themselves, he's undroppable, he cannot be dropped, so he's got a backbone? We saw him taking time off for the birth of his child as well. Do you think that can spark and start a fire within other sporting codes and sporting teams to be able to have such of a strength like Kohli's, or do you think only iconic sports people who have such of a following can do that?
Well, look, Kohli represents a new Indian generation. This is an Indian generation that has grown up 70 years after India won independence. So that what was called the colonial baggage, which people like us had, has gone. So they look at themselves and they think we are as good as anybody else. We don't need validation from somebody else. To give you an example of what I mean, I grew up in Mumbai, a city I still love, despite certain changes that are taking place which are distressing. But we still have in the center of Mumbai a park called Shivaji Park, which is, they call it a Maidan, but you know, people describe the Indian Maidan as like an English green. It's nothing remotely like that, you know. It's an open area where you can have ditches and canals and so on, and that is where Indians learn to play cricket. But when I was growing up, the Times of India's cricket correspondent, who was also the sports editor, a man called K.N. Prabhu, described Shivaji Park as the Pudsey of India. Pudsey is where Len Hutton learnt his cricket in Yorkshire. So what he meant by that was that Shivaji Park had become important because it could be compared to Pudsey. Now imagine if somebody in Pudsey would say, Pudsey is the Shivaji Park of Yorkshire.
Yeah.
That wouldn't enter the... So, you know, that was where we grew up in. We required the validation of somebody in England saying you're good, therefore to believe you're good. Virat Kohli doesn't require that validation. Virat Kohli is good because he believes he's good, he's told by people he's good, and he doesn't have to be told by somebody in England he's good. So if you do not have that baggage anymore, you can take decisions, you can be confident in saying things which in the past you wouldn't have thought about.
You talk about baggage in terms of colonial baggage, and one of the countries that comes to mind relating to the book that you wrote, Sporting Colours, is the South African cricket team. We've seen that there have been a few more black faces in the team since Mackay and Tini and some of those pioneers. But what we've seen is at the centre is the schools and the academies that are producing these players have remained the same. So the wider group of schools producing black South African cricketers hasn't changed. It stayed with elite schools within these communities. Do you think, have we really moved away from the colonial baggage, and what do you think needs to be done to change that in relation to that, if we can widen the gap and the scope of selection?
Well, South Africa is a very special country because South Africa, I feel very strongly about South Africa. I felt very strongly that there should be a sports boycott of South Africa. In fact, there should be an economic boycott of South Africa because South Africa damaged sport. And white South Africa hasn't been held responsible for it. In the sense, what white South Africa said? White South Africa said, we will only play with other white countries, which meant in cricket, Australia, New Zealand, and England. And not only that, white South Africa said, England can only play white players. And that led in 1968 to Basil D'Oliveira, who had been selected, who was what in South Africa was called Cape Coloured, had come to England to play first class cricket. He couldn't play that in South Africa, and qualified to play for England. And suddenly John Foster, the South African Prime Minister, decided to become an English cricket selector and said, no, you can't play. And now he did it on the basis of colour, not because he thought that D'Oliveira's medium-paced bowling would be too difficult for his South African team. But the point is that South Africa was allowed to get away with it, and South Africa was a very, very racially segregated society. I went to South Africa for the first time in 1990. Nelson Mandela still hadn't been released. And when I got to South Africa, I found that white people had no idea what black people were like. Soweto was not very far from Stanton, which was a great white enclave, but nobody had been to Soweto. In fact, one evening, let me tell you, I was in the Wanderers, which is the great stadium in Johannesburg, and as I was leaving Wanderers, I got a copy of the Sunday Times of Johannesburg, and as a journalist, you always want to pick up newspapers, a great newspaper in South Africa. And I came back to my hotel, and as I was about to enter my hotel, I saw a little black boy selling papers. And he looked at me and he said, Indian, and he thrust a copy of the paper in front of me. And I looked at the Sunday Times, and that looked different. So I bought it, I thought, oh, it's a different edition. When I went back to my hotel room, I found that it was actually the Sunday Times for the Indians. There was a wrap round the Sunday Times with Indian news, which the whites didn't have. So the Indians read the Indian news and the white, the white paper was inside the Indian. And this had a very curious moment. A year later, India toured South Africa for the very first time ever. I went to cover it for the Sunday Times. And in the first match in Durban, on the Sunday's play, there was an article in the Sunday Times about an Indian bowler called Manoj Prabhakar, who was a medium-pace bowler, about him being a sex symbol. And the Indian journalists were talking about it. And there was a lovely guy from the Daily Mail, of this country reporting. And he looked up his own paper and he couldn't find it. When I went up to him, I said, this is the disadvantage of being white, because it's only in the Indian edition, it's not in the white edition. Now, if you have a society like that, to change it in a few years is not easy. You have to have people. I mean, I was fortunate enough on a Sunday morning once to have coffee with Nelson Mandela, one of the great moments of my life. And Mandela then explained he'd just come out of prison, but the Rainbow Nation was still being argued about. It wasn't clear whether South Africa could get a Rainbow Nation, whether there would be tremendous violence or civil war and things like that. And he said he was going to use sport. And he gave us an example. He said de Klerk, who was the last president of White South Africa, had told him, listen, if you can get the All Black rugby team to come and play in South Africa, I can get my fellow whites to agree to a Rainbow Nation. And of course, Mandela used all that. But the point is, you can use sport, but as you say, the base of it has to change. So you have to have people go in to various areas. You have to have people know each other. As we were talking earlier, it's not so much that you think that one race is superior to the other, but if you don't know a person of another race, how can you pick them? How, if they don't play with you, how do you pick them? For instance, this has happened in Yorkshire. In Yorkshire, this happened in the 60s. The Asians found that they were not getting into the cricket team, so they formed their own league called the Quadi-Azam League. Imagine an own league which still exists, which is formed along racial lines, because only Asians play there, because they can't get into the right clubs and so on. Now you've got to break that down, and that takes time. That doesn't happen easily.
Yeah, and South Africa is only from 94 they gained independence, so they are around about 27.
Well, you see, you use the word independence. It's very interesting. For the white people, they were always independent. They would say, "What are you talking about, independence?" But your thinking on that, and I'm not questioning it, is different to how a white person would see it. And then a white person would feel that their world was perfect. And they only had to make minor changes.
And it does take time to shift that. We could speak all day, because you've got thousands of articles and thousands of things you've written upon this subject. But one question before we go is, if there's one thing within sport and politics, be it discriminatory, be it whatever it is, that you'd love to see change before time calls its time, what would that be?
Well, I think what I would like to see is more people appreciate the power of sport, but not use it as just a political weapon. Like a politician goes to a football match to pretend that he knows about sport. I mean, that's just symbolism. That is just playing politics with it. Use sport, and sport is great. As I said, sport can break down barriers. Sport can, Virat Kohli is known here. Whereas, cricketers that I grew up with when I was a young boy wouldn't be known here. Yeah. Now, for instance, if you follow the sports pages of recent days, there's a lot of talk about Vinu Mankad, because one of the Indian women cricketers ran out an English woman cricketer and won the match, But Mankad is being talked about in terms of a run out, and whether that was right or not, whether it was sporting enough or not. But, nobody would know who Vinu Mankad was. I grew up with knowing who Vinu Mankad was. Whereas Virat Kohli would be known. That is the difference. And once we have more awareness of who these people are, and therefore you break down the barriers, you get into a world where people say, "Oh yes, I've heard of that person." And of course, you're pronouncing Virat Kohli's name beautifully. So that's another thing.
Thank you. It's been an absolute pleasure to have a sit down with you. And my key takeaways is sport does have the power to change the world, and just make sure when you do that, you use it more for the positive change and not as a weapon to make worse of what the situation already is. That's Icons Corner, and Mr. Mihir Bose, thank you so much for spending time with us. Until next time, who knows who our next icon is?